I'm not your buddy, friend. He's not your friend, guy. I'm not your guy, buddy.
He's not your buddy, friend.
I'm not your friend, guy.
As the group continues to travel, Sparrow and Amory explain a bit more of Iworth's political situation. As while Dwokdar is a threat, they don't control the largest of territories for them to worry about them a lot. In fact, while there are a few differing nations in the world, the largest nations happen to be the Land of Mana and the Land of the Beasts. Or to just spoil it, the transplanted settings of Cross Ange, that frankly made sense to include in an isekai-driven game, and that of Gurren Lagann, which kind of has its own problems considering how Gurren Lagann starts, but we're actually on the other side of Gurren Lagann's mid-season timeskip by the time we get to them, so the pre-timeskip part of the tale is just treated as a civil war. Regardless, as the Land of Mana is closer, the group decides to try detouring to it to warn someone with any authority over the lands of Dwokdar gaining power from the displaced travelers. And Nadia has to be a complete bitch about it because she thinks it's better to not fight people who would callously murder anyone in their way. Yeah, one can be an idealist all one wants, but when your principles cause you to enable actual malice towards others, you can be just as complicit in the harm done. Nadia as a person, even in her own series, is one that never takes responsibility for her own actions, so she has no right to judge and condemn those who at least try to do the right thing and stand up to tyrants. For a grand majority of the time, those tyrants are nothing but cowardly bullies who are only allowed to get away with what they do because of those who enable and do not stand up to their malice, like Nadia is telling them to do. Evil triumphs when those who claim to be good people do nothing, and the quickest path to true evil is to ignore or forget what evil is. That was also a fundamental aspect of Kira Yamato's arc when he acknowledged from the start of Seed that his principles are not worth more than real people's lives. Nadia doesn't. She acts like she has all the answers and never learns otherwise. But as they're dealing with the aftermath of Nadia's latest act of hypocritical myopia, we get our next group of displaced characters, them being from the Reguild Century Gundam timeline, also known as the cast of Gundam Reconguista in G-Reco for short because Reconguista is not a word, such being Yoshiyuki Tomino's return to the franchise in 2014. And it bombed because it is one of, if not the most poorly told series in the entire Gundam franchise. And as a result, it is a contender for worst series of them all. And that's no joke, G-Reco is infamous for its poor reception, which was reflected in its sales. No one liked the show enough to buy any of its merchandise, so it became the least watched and worst selling series Sunrise put out that fiscal year, when G-Reco was supposed to be a major earnings tentpole due to Tomino's return. Now, some might argue that a show should not be judged by how much merchandise it sells, and that is fair. A show should be judged on the merits of its actual content, as you are there for the characters and the story they go through, which should be the focus. However, when someone is a fan of something, many would then find themselves wanting to purchase something that reflects their enjoyment of that series, as it can help show with its sales that more series similar to the one you like should be made. So depending on the series, you can determine how well it was received by how well its merchandise sold. Though, there are a bunch of qualifiers to that, as just raw earnings for a series can be deceptive depending on how much was put out for sale. If a small line of products sold a lot, then it would consequently be seen as doing better than a large line that only earned as much as the small line, as more resources were invested in the large line that weren't made back. And thus, in the grand scheme of things, it's less that a series is about shilling merchandise, but more about how making something an audience does like will cause it to earn more easily, simply by more people being willing to buy even just little trinkets related to it, as there has been garnered a wider positive emotional investment towards it. You will elicit those positive feelings when you look at something related to it, as it evokes those positive memories of experiencing it. And that does not happen with a bad show or one that is just about the merchandise, as those garner a smaller audience and it's far less likely to trigger that emotional response. And thus, only relying on a collector's market who will buy anything regardless of quality, or dumbing it down to the lowest common denominator to just sell them toys, will only destroy companies' viability in the long term, as less and less will be earned from doing that over time. Moreover, Gundam merchandise sales for Sunrise, they have been used as the financial tentpole for Sunrise since Gundam's first model kits released in 1980, after the original 0079 series ended, making it so a show that was cancelled after Tomino pissed off and lost its original financial sponsors, then had it recognized how many of those watching fervently enjoyed it by them buying merchandise of it when such finally became available, thus leading to Gundam's wider recognition as a cultural phenomena, which it would not have had otherwise. All of Gundam's sequel series only happened because the posthumous merch sales showed that the series was something special, and Tomino himself had done the most damage to it as, well, Tomino hates merchandising. For those not aware of what a tentpole in this context is, it is an idiom used to describe a series that is meant to support the financial well-being of a company, by which to then use the earned funds from that tentpole to finance other projects, referred to as tiers, that might not earn enough themselves to warrant their production. Production companies for film, TV, and video games have that all the time. The big blockbuster IPs earn their studios millions, by which to then funnel to productions that deserve the time, but might not garner the audience to support themselves. For Sunrise, them having tentpoles like Gundam, and in the 90s the Brave series as well, are the reasons why tiers like Cowboy Bebop, Outlaw Star, The Big O, Code Geass, Scride, Escaflowne, and so many other great series from them were even greenlit. The larger series expected to be successful covered the bill, so they could take a risk on these smaller intellectual properties to make them at a possible loss without jeopardizing the viability of the company. And a lot of great series from many companies came about because of this concept, which would have not have happened otherwise. A company's sponsors would still ask these series to have something that can be made into merchandise to help cover their costs, but it isn't required they be big earners when a tentpole is covering the initial investment, as the weight of what many view as necessary evil is placed on the shoulders of another that has been shown to be able to carry it. And G-Reco's merchandise notoriously did not sell by which to do its job as a tentpole. They did so poorly, it's actually really hard to find G-Reco merchandise now in comparison to any other major Gundam series. Even with Tomino's reanimate literally every scene, even the ones we don't need to, compilation movies for the series. They're the only non-build Gundam timeline series that exists to have no master-grade scale or even full mechanics gunpla of its units made, simply out of a lack of interest or demand for such products from the audience that would buy them. And while it's not the only factor in this, it is still notable that after G-Reco, Sunrise's production pipeline, stagnated, spending the next 6 years only releasing as much content over that time as they had in just 2013 and 2014. Most of their studios shifted to just doing second unit animation work for non-Sunrise productions, instead of original ones of their own. And when it did release, it was not out of the blue risks upon new IPs, but only adaptations or continuations of existing franchises. It not until Kyokai Senki in 2022 that they took a risk on a new original IP again, as they couldn't afford to take risks. This is also around when Sunrise became more open to releasing series online as original net animation, such as Gundam Build Divers Re-Rise, which got them direct market viewership and engagement internationally. Hell, we ended up getting the Gundam Blu-rays we have because of this, as Sunrise in late 2015 made a direct deal with anime distributor Right Stuf to re-release all the past Gundam series through their Nozomi division, as that had been a revenue stream closed to Sunrise after the collapse of Bandai Visual and Entertainment years before. And that's believed to be a consequence, but also a positive outcome, for this slump of the company, and them scrambling for cash. For when a tentpole series doesn't carry its weight, it can be very difficult to recover. After all, it wasn't just G-Reco that had a problem, but Gundam Age in 2012 and 2013 also underperformed in viewership and sales, to the point that it also had master grades intended for release cancelled from its run. That series losing out to both of the Gundam Seed remasters that aired around it, which is in part why Sunrise brought Tomino back to Gundam to begin with. Their previous project had also not done well, so they wanted to see if one of the original creators of the franchise could breathe back life into it. Though this ends up being a hindsight issue with regards to that, as Ange's largest problem was it was too centrally echoing Tomino's series while ignoring Gundam's larger meta-narrative regarding how every series from G Gundam through 00 had been calling out varied shortcomings of Tomino's UC Gundam series, particularly in how the UC series left in power the very individuals that had ruined the setting in the first place to set off their conflicts by denying the common man their freedom. So things never ended up improving. All the AU timeline series before Ange had avoided repeating this oversight, and in their own ways called that out, with 00 taking it the farthest by deliberately casting Amuro Ray's Japanese voice actor, Toru Furuya, as their primary villain, Ribbon's Allmark, as an explicit clapback against the UC series' own hypocrisy, due to Ribbon's own efforts to make 00's setting a more fascist totalitarian oligarchy that echoed UC Gundam's own. His death at the end meant to be symbolic of letting the franchise move on from their past shortcomings as Gundam had hit its 30th anniversary. And that is where Ange screwed things up, as being a modernized celebration of the series that hadn't aged well thanks to this recontextualized perspective. That is not everything regarding the problems of Ange, and one can enjoy it in spite of this, but it does play part in why it saw rejection. Though I'll emphasize again, if you look at all this from only an earnings perspective, well, that will not give you the specifics regarding those earnings, and are less reliable overall by which to judge the health of an IP, thanks to all those overlapping projects. Hell, this sudden earnings spike at the start of the 2010s is in large part thanks to Bandai's high-grade All Gundam initiative, where they began to remake old models with modern engineering, regardless of what was airing. So sales for the franchise diversified from just what the running series was doing. And throughout the 2010s, at least 2 Gundam projects were debuting a year. Yet, despite this, there's still that dip in fiscal year 2015, which related to G-Reco. Hell, that number only isn't worse because of G-Reco's running mate, Gundam Build Fighters Try, which was reported to have exceeded expectations. And it's not like Gundam's had a positive earnings uptick every year. Fiscal years 2017 and 18 had downturns too, but were associated with smaller, less expensive projects, so were not as big damage hits. And yes, this is still a lot of money. Sunrise and Bandai were not going to go bankrupt because of G-Reco not delivering on its investment. That's not what I'm talking about with this. But when you expect massive earnings from the franchise's credited creator coming back, and for that series to earn the money to finance other series they wanted to make, and they're only saved from having a worse year financially by a side project about custom model kit tournaments, and everything released independently of the active production? That's not a good thing, and is a contributing factor to why Sunrise didn't take any risks with new IPs again for years. But it is also hilarious karmic irony when one remembers the reason why the original 0079 Gundam got cancelled was because Tomino pissed off the show's sponsors, who summarily dropped funding the show outright, and Gundam only got continuations due to the model kits released after that cancellation, then showing how popular the series was across all ages and genders, and led to its continuation, which Tomino has always just written off as boys only caring about toys, even though boys were not the only ones buying the Gunpla. Yet when he comes back again in 2014 to do a new series, it really was beaten out by one of the series that celebrates the hobbyists that led to that revival, which he's shown nothing but disdain towards. For a series has to garner people to want products associated with it in the first place. That is how merchandising works. If there is no audience for something, then it's not going to sell well. The content has to be liked for a product related to it to at bare minimum break even. That's just basic economics. Yet the single most consistent thing about Tomino is his hatred of merchandising and sponsorship, and Bandai specifically, but even his reasoning is self-contradictory. He wants them to collaborate and be an active part of the creative process, far past the point where they have any right to be. He also complains about when they send back notes in the development stage of a series at a time when they are supposed to be involved. I have interviews where Tomino derides Bandai for not giving him feedback on names for characters in his series, which they have no right to micromanage. This, by the way, being the origin of wacky Tomino naming. yet also ones where he then did get a reasonable feedback from his sponsors, and he reinterpreted the intents of it into just market a toy, when the suggestion was not at all about merchandise shilling and would have been a good idea. Such as when Bandai asked about whether Tomino could do more ship battles in Victory Gundam to diversify the combat scenes, and he had this god-awful thing designed instead. Like, that wasn't what they suggested. He made something so imbecilely toyetic just out of spite.
Toyetic is a word created by marketing people. It means an object or device featured in a cartoon that could easily become a mass-produced toy.
It's stuff like this that makes me take anything Tomino says about Bandai with a grain of salt, as while the company and those under their corporate umbrella have done bad things, and I do not want to disregard any of that, these are not legitimate criticisms or examples of a company overstepping their boundaries. It instead comes off as a guy with an ego antagonizing those who pay his bills. Which is made worse when you learn that some of the things Tomino blamed Bandai for, yeah, they were decisions made internally at Sunrise with no involvement from Bandai. And that hasn't stopped happening either, thanks to Sunrise being rebranded as Bandai Namco Studios, as now Bandai even more takes the heat for Sunrise's bad decisions, where they have had a longer precedent of screwing up, such as them repeatedly interfering with the relationships their creative staffs intended to showcase. But at the end of the day, there is no one else but Yoshiyuki Tomino to blame for the problems of G-Reco. Like Garzy's Wing and Rings of Rian, Tomino is the sole writer credited for the series. No one else was responsible for this one but him. And Tomino's own statements about the series made it worse as it conflicted with Sunrise's own stances about Gundam continuity, which goes all the way back to Turn A Gundam. Tomino's interviews around the series framed G-Reco as a sequel series to Turn A Gundam, which undermined Turn A's story, whose themes are explicitly about those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, which played its own part in Gundam's larger meta-narrative regarding its relation to the UC series' central critique. Thus, you can't make a sequel to Turn A Gundam without destroying the narrative purpose of that show, especially with a key event in Turn A Gundam that has, admittedly, only gotten worse with age. I like Turn A Gundam. It is one of the most beautifully animated Gundam series ever made, but I will not say it is without fault. A major story point of Turn A is the fabled Black History of the world, a period of time no one has record of due to it being considered too dangerous to be known. But when the Black History is exposed, it is revealed that the series is set thousands of years after the events of all Gundam series made before Turn A was, including not just Universal Century series, but also G, Wing, and X. For Turn A as a mathematical symbol means convergence. Thus, this series title was meant to mean a convergence of all of Gundam. And the series itself reflected this by Turn A's story drawing a bit of basis from every Gundam series made before it, which is what it was thematically supposed to be. But then the revelations about the Black History story made a mess of that, because Tomino, and from what I've seen in interviews, only Tomino wanted it to be the last Gundam series ever made, and this take of the Black History was to be the capstone on every production and a closure of the entire franchise. The problem was, that was never going to happen thanks to the aforementioned nature of the Gundam franchise being Sunrise's only remaining financial tentpole after Takara canceled the Brave series. Of course, they were going to keep doing more series after Turn A. That was never in doubt. Only Tomino seemed to ever insist on that. But also, well, G, Wing, and X are not canonically in the Universal Century timeline, nor were they intended to be due to the fundamental incompatibilities of their stories and settings. Case in point, Australia, Midwestern America, and Ireland are all annihilated due to colony drops in the Universal Century. Those locations still exist when you see world maps of G, Wing, and X, let alone other series. Thus, show that in their canon versions, they do not, and cannot follow from Universal Century Gundam's events. Now, we can hand-wave that in crossover material as there's ways to change their story to make them fit. But for official canon, no. There's too many contradictions for that to be valid. Hell, Turn A itself wasn't meant to be canon with the previous Gundam series either, but its own distinct separate entity. Or at least it was in everyone else but Tomino's mind. What was supposed to be depicted in the Black History was a conflict that paralleled what had been happening throughout Turn A Gundam's own tale. And yet as a cost-saving measure, Tomino, who was the acting producer of Turn A, had the production staff just cutting clips of old Gundam series to depict the Black History, completely uncaring to G, Wing, and X's inclusion, not making sense. Well, I should not say uncaring with this, as he actually did care, so it was more a case of him being unaware. In an interview from 2015 that I was sent, Tomino revealed that he had not seen any Gundam series he did not make, so he didn't even know there were separate Gundam timelines not part of Universal Century Gundam until after G-Reco had been completed. Which actually puts in context Tomino's derision towards Mitsuo Fukada, which isn't just because Fukada actually can work with Bandai. When Fukada first got assigned what would become Gundam Seed, he informed Tomino of what was happening, and out of respect for Tomino's prior work on the series, asked for any advice. And most of Tomino's suggestions Fukada couldn't do, as they were intended for a Universal Century series that they were not making. Even then, Tomino thought all of Gundam was just Universal Century, and not adhering to his advice was defaming his work when that was just not the case. You can see why I tend to associate Tomino with this meme, even if he isn't intentionally an awful person. As this all was an innocent misunderstanding that did spiral into a lot of unneeded toxicity and hate when fans latched onto it. This ended up causing a greater headache for Sunrise in the long run, as Tomino's mistaken assertion that all of Gundam is one timeline was taken as gospel by many despite how little sense that makes, as it hadn't been so in years. The AU timelines conflict with that and cannot have their stories occur as depicted if such is the case. Sunrise eventually releasing this chart to explain Turn A's continuity during Seed's run due to the discourse, and it's ever since been maintained that Turn A only occurs in its own alternate timeline, where the series made before Turn A were one long series of successive wars. But their original series depiction are not to be treated as the same as what Turn A's Black History is. Nor was anything produced after Turn A that wasn't part of those previous timelines to be counted. So Gundam Unicorn or Thunderbolt might count to be folded into Turn A's correct century timeline, but Seed, 00, Age, Fighters, IBO, G-Witch, and onwards would not count for that. Nor were the canonical versions of G, Wing, and X made retroactively Universal Century content. An alternate version of their events occurs in Turn A's timeline, not the ones we saw. Unfortunately, Tomino kept asserting it was all one canon until someone finally corrected him, several of which I was sent by people in response to when I talked about this during their V-reviews, ergo why I am reiterating this now. It getting so bad that the manual for the Turn X Gundam's Master Grade had whoever wrote its text blurbs about Turn A's story state that Turn A occurs after all other Gundam series, including the ones produced after Turn A was. So it's been a long-standing argument that only existed outside the series due to Tomino's own unintended ignorance of the franchise beyond the ones he worked on. Inside the series, however, and explicitly on the American retail release Blu-rays, G-Reco itself explicitly states that its events occur 1,014 years into the Reguild Century, an era begun immediately following the collapse of the Universal Century calendar. So none of the other timelines are actually in there. And that is what Sunrise itself has stuck to about G-Reco, as they don't want another Turn A situation where what Turn A's continuity is said to be now varies wildly depending on interview and source. I still go by this original diagram with regards to Turn A, as it makes no sense to start retroactively making even more series that are incompatible try to be slave to that, when the ones already included being enough of a headache on their own. If you see something different stated on the Gundam Wiki or someplace else, that's the reason. Various people hearing of contradictory accounts over this entire mess between Tomino and Sunrise itself. But this is not something you can word of God, as he has no right to with them. And the only reason this conflict even got restarted with G-Reco is because G-Reco is another of Tomino's works that was solely written by him, and that story is not conveyed well, it acting in conflict with its intent. The central root of the problem is G-Reco introduces a lot of political factions to its story, all vying for power and control and to free themselves from oppressive powers or crush underfoot those who can't be responsible with power. And yet because Tomino is so poor at distinguishing reasons for actions beyond invalidated hate and selfishness and needless animosity, these various political factions all just bleed into one another. It's not even a case of you can't tell the good guys from the bad guys. You don't even get a concrete reason for their conflict, as why they're doing what they are is in conflict with the means to achieve that goal which they've ignored, thus making the entire story difficult to follow, alongside many of their plot points being entirely unjustified. Like, people accused G-Witch of having the same issue, but here's the thing about that. All of G-Witch's corporate factions, they're actually the same group of assholes, just divisions within a larger corporate conglomerate that's responsible for things that went wrong, and they're all infighting. Thus, their individual names don't as much matter, merely what they contributed to cause the abusive status quo that is broken over the course of the series. G-Reco's factions, they're supposed to be completely distinct, unique entities with separate goals, motivations, and origins, but they so bleed into each other and have their reasons be so stupid in context to what they're doing that it is far more difficult to care and keep track of them as they're acting in contradiction of their stated intent to self-sabotage their own goals without reason. And the abrasiveness of how Tomino writes his characters frequently gets in the way of properly digesting whatever ideas he's trying to get across. And G-Reco, of any series Tomino has been involved in, short of Victory Gundam or his Dunbine spin-offs, is the most guilty of this. Like, Tomino keeps including new type psychic powers, but the way they're depicted makes it so even when someone who can see into and read someone else's mind sees the absolute truth of another person, that psychic still can't understand anyone but themselves. I don't get that. Among the biggest offenders on this being that of main characters Bellry Zenem and Ida Surugan, who over the course of the story are revealed to not be just siblings, but also royalty. Royalty in a setting that has long outgrown any concept of monarchy. Right, that totally makes sense. You know, Gundam Wing was mocking such a concept as ridiculous when it made Relena Peacecraft queen of the world, right? And that was 20 years earlier! The problem, however, is just the sheer randomness of how they came to meet again after spending their lives separate from the other, to then have those revelations occur. Tomino purportedly wanted a Luke and Leia story echoing Star Wars with the two, but as depicted, the comparison is fleeting. If you look at Star Wars' plotline from what is made available narratively, and you ignore that Leia was not originally intended as the sister, but it just worked out that way from what was there to use when George Lucas scaled back his franchise plans, then the two coming into contact follows a line of logic. Leia is trying to recruit who she believes is the last Jedi to help her. Obi-Wan is staying near Luke to protect the son of his best friend, who he feels he failed and possibly train him as the way to repent for that. Luke deciding to assist Obi-Wan in helping Leia draws the two into camaraderie until the later connection is revealed. That is a logical chain of events. G-Reco does not do this, instead just shoving them together and forcing them to stay together against all internal logic. Worse, Gundam already did the Luke and Leia sibling storyline with Kira and Kigali in Gundam Seed, following a similar enough narrative beat as Star Wars to flag such as the proper homage, as Gundam Seed's main creators were huge Western sci-fi fans. Yet, G-Reco doesn't pull that off with Bellry and Ida, to the point that before their familiar revelation, their meeting had more in common with Gundam Unicorn towards Bondinger and Minerva, making people flag such as a potential romance arc. Despite there being problems with that as well, but again, it plays into the problem of excessive redundancy Universal Century Gundam suffers. Though, let's be honest, thinking a pair of secret siblings might be paramours is unintentionally baked into the homage. Regardless, the various Earth factions don't trust each other, for no other reason than they don't. These groups only putting aside their differences as people from space are viewed as a threat to them, as those in space somehow control all means of electrical power the planet has left. And those batteries they are supplied with are only manufactured on Venus. Which doesn't make any damn sense when one is aware of how ridiculous it is to ferry a supply line of batteries between planets when you can just build solar energy collectors around the damn planet themselves. They did that in Double O just fine, and G-Reco is supposed to be over 1,000 years more advanced than Double O's setting. Yeah, the only reason it's there is, one, to parallel the Jupiter fleet in UC Gundam, but there they were ferrying fuel to the planet where it would then be used as that fuel couldn't be made or found in large enough quantities on Earth as anything solar-powered or charged would be. And two, to say that Space Noids have created an oppressive system of control over Earth, keeping from them knowledge and technology, to show why full-frontal nudity's plan in Gundam Unicorn would have been so bad if he'd been allowed to enact his real estate scheme, even though that's what the Federation government itself does a decade later. When logistically, such oppression in the way G-Reco presents it is needlessly wasteful. You can justify it easily by shifting the paradigm, but the show deliberately doesn't want to do so. And the people from space now want back on Earth despite the sustainability of the civilization they have built in space to make that not be needed, as is the problem from F-91 and Victory with their antagonists. There is a later reason stated why the spacers want off the colonies, but it's so egregious a reason that it should have prevented people living in space to begin with thousands of years before this. And then it's revealed the big bad of the series that's assumed control of the hostile Earth faction is in fact from the space faction. So instead of all this being the fault of regressive morons who never learn from their mistakes, or an oppressive controlling system that causes harm to the masses, it's all the fault of a man who thought it'd be a good idea to instigate a war for no other reason than it would make people stronger to learn the horrors of war. Even though senseless war-making has caused more atrocities if there is not proper instigation for conflict. So this entire event is blamed on him and every other inciting factor which enabled him, leading to the escalation that would have valid citation or a showcase of irreconcilable differences against a controlling and oppressive mastermind, are all rendered invalid. So the very systems that harm the people who live in the setting can thus continue unopposed as nothing has actually been done about them. G-Reco consequently repeats the same sin of Universal Century series, in that it leaves in power those who cause the grievances that should lead to the incitement of such conflicts. So at the end of the day, nothing is learned from the atrocities of war, and the peace and understanding that leads wish to promote will not address the root problems of the setting that should have been the focus. And that's another reason why G-Reco was not well received, as we have done that story already, multiple times. It had just been done with Gundam Age. We'd also just had the Gundam Unicorn OVAs, which was directly calling out this stagnation in universe after the Gundam Seed series had brought attention to the issue in big, bold letter text, and Double O showed how to fight back successfully against that stagnation and avoid the same narrative issues. And all other AU series had made their stories be about how such controlling manipulators have to be taken out to change the world for the better. So a series that was repeating the error and then saying centuries later that people were still going to ignore the problem instead of learning from it? Yeah. No. That doesn't fly. At the end of the day, G-Reco is the most redundant Gundam series, even if you don't think it's the worst one, as it doesn't address anything that had not already been explored before and better. And those in the audience who aren't aware of all this are probably wondering how G-Reco got a compilation movie series to even retell the story if it flopped so badly originally. And I have no idea. I generally have no concrete explanation for that. Merely a suspicion that Tomino sold Bandai the rights to the novel Hathaway's Flash in exchange for them funding the film remake of the series. As technically, when Bandai bought out Sunrise in the 90s, they did not by default in that purchase obtain the rights to all Gundam media. There have been some outliers, such as the Gundam Sentinel novels and other supplementary material released in the 80s that Bandai to this day does not own. And Tomino's Hathaway's Flash was one of them, to the point that they didn't even produce a single model kit related to Hathaway until 2020, nearly 30 years after Tomino originally wrote the story. It's the only thing we can really guess at in this, considering Tomino's notorious animosity towards Bandai to begin with. It is to both G-Reco's benefit and detriment that its main cast is taken from their home setting then. As well they bring the war with them, they're largely removed from a lot of the dumb of their tale that isn't character-based. It doesn't work and that separation makes it harder to tell their story in Super Robot Wars, but getting them the hell away from it would permit one to possibly appreciate them more than their core series would allow. In theory, not so much execution. As in reality, it makes such even more idiotic with how they continue their conflicts while entirely removed from being able to gain anything out of it. Exportly introducing the crew as being early in their journey when Bearimy and Ida are sniping at each other over Bearimy killing someone Ida loved, which is subsequently forgotten about a lot in G-Reco. Love to Tomino is something of a fleeting emotion. And yet Bearimy acts like the selfish, inconsiderate jerk in the situation. Yeah, another reason why X is not positively thought of. Quite simply,
I knew it, I'm surrounded by assholes.
Seriously, a lot of Bearimy's characterization problems are shared by other Tomino protagonists, in that they're obstinate and confrontational even in situations where they know they're in the wrong. Not every teenager is a complete jackass, and Bearimy is actually screwed up enough to deserve his ostracization. And this line of his I just outright hate. Not just because it's hypocritical by Bearimy himself acting in violation of it, it's literally a paraphrasing of the train of thought seen of Suzaku Kururugi in Code Geass. But while Suzaku is that series' tritagonist who is supposed to be recognized as being in the wrong, Bearimy's version is delivered sincerely, and the series bends over backwards to make everyone else conform to that condemnation, as opposed to seeing if their views have any legitimacy. This justified animosity on Ida's side comes into play when their Char clone character, literally just named Mask, is found to also be on Alworth and strikes at them. Bearimy trying to make up for some of his screw-ups in defending Ida's G-Arcane with his G-Self unit, as G-Self is designed for close combat, while the Arcane is a sniper-focused unit, them holding off Mask and his Capital Nation allies until the rest of Wataru's party arrives and assists in fending them off. But unlike the last several minions, Mask's faction has not allied with Dwakdar, but instead become the minions of the Mitsurugi Empire in order to survive here, acting as guardians of their territory, which Bearimy's group had actually violated to justify this attack, thus showing Bearimy as the hypocrite. Granted, that point is entirely lost as the Mitsurugi Empire is cross-Ange content, which at this point in their timeline is after it was taken over by Ange's idiot of an elder brother to act as a pawn of stupid hair embryo. So Bearimy just gets to skate out of the condemnation as Mask Group is serving antagonists despite having no choice if they want to get home. Wataru's group is brought aboard the capital carrier of G-Reco, the Megafauna, which is a complete trash fire of a ship, both in design and in armament, with respect to the gameplay, with it being the overall weakest ship unit we ever get. Like, I don't even know where to begin with how bad a design it is. It really only beaten by the wheeled ship from Victory of Tomino's series. There's that much wrong with it, including but not limited to how the bridge is immediately above the only launch deck, meaning that if anything attacks or explodes in that area, that immediately destroys the bridge and sinks the ship. It is completely form over function, and that follows for most of the G-Reco designs where they just don't make sense from a functionality standpoint. I guess I'm more irritated at being stuck with this ship than I should be, as, well, Super Robot Wars V overdid it with the number of ship units they had. And ever since V, the Super Robot Wars games have limited the number of ships units one can have. So they are all, by default, story event units. You can't choose what ships you want to deploy anymore, as they don't include enough to make a choice. This is especially terrible in X's case, as it means that several ships that one would think would be part of the game, such as Cross Ange's Libertas and Code Geass's Ikaruga, are excluded. And the same problem follows into T and 30, where we're stuck with ship units that are terrible, ones we want nothing to do with, or ones that are overused, while ship units that should have seen spotlight are skipped over. Regardless, Wataru's group are gotten up to speed with this group, in that the pirate crew of the Megafauna have come to assist the Amerian faction of G-Reco's conflict due to them trying to restore peace to their nations. And then the whole world shift happened to land them here. Because the land of Mata is at this point revealed to largely be hostile to outsiders, it now makes less sense why they came here to begin with. But they still have to travel through it to get to the next destination in Wataru's journey anyways. A pair of bonus missions gives the group a bit of a breather regarding their interactions. The first being a bit more elaboration on just what the Machine Region Maru is. That being the first of the dragon gods Wataru is supposed to find, whose own power is used to animate his clay figure and use it as its host body as a robot. It's more intended as a character story for that being, but it misses its mark by such also being a vehicle for Grandis and her minions thinking that Ryujin Maru being a god entity makes it too good for us. At least until a fight occurs where Ryujin Maru just starts spouting a bunch of puns. Because Walkthrough is apparently that kind of series, and again, I don't really fault it for that, as Ryujin Maru is just trying to be social and not make it seem like he's an existence that makes it better than anyone else it relies upon. It's not like Ryujin Maru can awaken the other dragons on its own. The second of the two is in turn focused on the G-Reco cast, and how a lot of people are making excuses for Bearimy concerning his killing of the guy Ida loved, and how they all want Ida to get over it and forgive Bearimy because Bearimy loves her too. Yeah, this is before it's revealed they're siblings, but that is not an excuse to deliberately insist on promoting the incest. Atop that, it's more of that same bending over backwards to excuse Bearimy's actions, and misses that the death is still recent and present in Ida's mind, and she's struggling to come to terms with it because Bearimy will not let it be, as he thinks the apology he made over it is enough. And it's not. That takes time for their loved ones to get over, and constantly reminding them of what happened is not the way to get them to forgive you faster. So everyone on the megafauna treating Ida as if she's the one with the problem? No, that doesn't work. As the younger members of this group got lost along with the child-minded Rara Ira they were playing with, long story, she's the original pilot of Bearimy's G-Self, but is suffering from amnesia that reverted her to said childlike mind. Ergo why she went with the other little children in this scenario. Said girls ending up being found by Barara, one of masked subordinates that were out on their own mission, realizing they were with the megafauna crew and try to use them as baits, which Ida takes offense to and says as much to demoralize and guilt them. With Bearimy missing the point entirely of what she's doing, as Bearimy is a complete moron who continues to not realize how genuinely hypocritical he sounds with his condemnations of Ida, when Ida is acting properly in response to the situation, as she was not just reprimanding them, but distracting them with her words so the group's ground specialist can rescue the kids without anyone being a casualty. Moreover, had Ida's words actually gotten through to those who had the girls, this would have settled the entire matter peacefully with no one needing to be harmed at all. So it's especially poor for Bearimy to be condescending towards her when he doesn't even realize what she's doing. Like, I'll admit, me not liking G-Reco or its cast is bleeding a bit over into my recap of X on this. But X's content with them is not doing itself any favors by it not doing anything to fix any of the interpersonal issues of the cast members or properly call out those who are being insensitive, like happened in V. With the girls rescued, it's a quick pushback against the capital forces, the group reconvening on the megafauna and deciding to properly organize everyone into the deployment group that will be led by Ida, due to her having the most competence at tactics for the time being, and the domestic crew that will play support when they're off duty, that will hopefully keep the kids from repeating this incident again. Which is helpful, for as they begin their proper traversal through the land of Mana, who should appear from another dimensional gate but freaking dragons? Which properly starts the cross-Ange part of the plot, with them all being assisted by the intervening Angelis Ikaruga Mitsurugi and fellow Paramel pilot Vivian, as the land of Mana in X is the more series-accurate version of the cross-Ange story for the most part, with Ange and her fellow Paramore pilots of Arsenal finding dimensional gates the dragons open and hunting them down, with said dragon hunts making the dragons instantly hostile to anyone with a giant robot. Now admittedly, with the land of Mana not being everything that makes up the world in this iteration, you'd think that the dragons would try and contact anyone else on the planet to explain what their deal is. After all, in V, the world Cross-Ange was set on was secretly controlled by her central villain, so that wouldn't have worked. Here, not so much. However, one can rationalize this by Arsenal's dragon hunts simply just getting to them too fast for the dragons to know that there are potential allies for them on this world, especially with how isolationist the region is to cover up the atrocities their system is built to perpetuate. What is less defensible is, well, Vivian being here. Not because Vivian is a bad character, but because her inclusion here does nothing for the story, not helped by where they have even chosen to set this relative to Cross-Ange's own continuity. As well, it doesn't have any point of intersection by which to connect them. Just another blip of unseen events that leaves them entirely disconnected from that story, as Ange and Vivian will be joining Wataru's mission. But that separation resultantly doesn't allow anything to be done with the rest of Cross Ange's cast by which to remedy the inter-character antagonism that made Cross Ange's early episodes awful. Whereas, had, say, Hilda been swapped in for this, then you could have set their whole story to coincide with when Ange and Hilda left Arsenal to try and see their respective families a third of the way through their series, with that being subverted into joining this troupe, likewise allowing X to entirely skip the worst of Cross Ange's story when the entire cast were being horrible to each other for little justified reason. As, had Hilda been here, it would have worked to fix a different flaw in Cross Ange's story. As I said in the Super Robot War V reviews, the only sign in the main story before the mid-season where Hilda shows romantic affection for Ange is through actions that align her with being a Sadodere, one who torments the one they're crushing on to see if they're worthy of seeing the other, softer side, but is an interpretation that can be misconstrued as them being a bullying jerk. The view of Hilda liking Ange is hampered due to them spending little time on screen together, and Ange playing part in why Hilda loses advantages she was trying to gain, so some of her actions also read as her holding a grudge, up until they leave for the family plot, and it's only after they're brought back and imprisoned that they then bond. But them bonding is resultantly mostly off-screen. Then the mid-season events occur, and by the time they meet up again, they're in the midst of the war with Embryo, so the time that they have leading up to Hilda's confession is mostly off-screen, and others noting Hilda's new romantic obsession. It's still canon that Ange has her little harem of cast members, with Tusk being the primary because he was helpful and has the most tangible romance arc between the two, even with the accidental perverted crap everyone who has ever seen the series calls out. But Super Robot Wars? The series is supposed to take the problems of canon and address them so they are smoothed over, and they don't do that at all this time. So if Hilda was here instead of Vivian, what would you think would happen? First off, if they're both on the run from Arsenal, having allies helps them keep a cover. Second, being the ones of their series interacting longer amidst everything gives them a better rapport by which to ground for the audience the viability of a relationship between them. Third, extended interaction allows for further on-screen character development that allows an audience more insight into how a character thinks. That causes them to not have to guess and look for in retrospect how a person might have acted, may not have been how they wanted to act or was obfuscating another facet of themselves. As said, it takes a second look at Hilda's character to realize she is a Sadodere, and her actions in part informed by her attraction. Furthermore, Hilda, once she is introduced deep into the game, is quickly rushed through all 3 units she pilots due to how late in X they finally start using the plot from Crossing, which would have been averted had Hilda been here instead of Vivian. Vivian never gets a mech upgrade and has little in the way of attacks, but had Hilda been here, she's in her first unit type while amidst these events, will get her second unit when the rest of the Arsenal crew is recruited, and then it's properly paced when she steals for herself one of the Ragnamail. No story crunch, no rapid unit swapping, and you get time to expand on a character in a romance arc she was part of, which would have allowed the long-existing actor illusion stuff between the two to take effect. An actor illusion I didn't bring up before because to most people it's obvious. Hilda's voice actress is Yukari Tamura, most known as Nanoha Takamichi from the lyrical Nanoha anime series, which I actually really like and I'm grateful they're getting newer home releases recently. And said character is canonically in a relationship with Nana Mizuki's character Fate Testarossa, and Cross Ange with Hilda and Ange was deliberately alluding to that with them because Lyrical Nanoha was a big series in both of their careers. Neither did main star roles, only side characters before Nanoha, and they've been characters both have stayed attached to. Thus, alluding to that role and past when they come back together in another series makes sense. And X did not take advantage of that when it had an open opportunity to. This is all an example of what is truly the damning aspect of X and why it's not a good Super Robot Wars game. It does not take advantage of what it has to improve its story and series amalgamation, merely introducing cast members to use them as units or excuses for why certain things happen, but it does not give them material to work with. Hell, including Vivian here is a waste too, as it in no way addresses something important about her character either that I touched on before. That she's a dragon who is only prevented from returning to her dragon form because of the lollipops containing medicine that keeps her in human form. And I can't think she would have had that large a supply of those on her to be out and away from Arsenal for as long as the game keeps them out of it, which thus deliberately and unnecessarily invokes plot holes. Cross Ange isn't the only series included here that has this problem, but it's the clearest example of it due to how easily it could have been improved by taking advantage of one character and swapping them around. Hell, once Callan and Lelouch joined the party, it would have been even more hilarious to poke fun at the kinds of people girl Lelouch and boy Ange have feelings for. This battle here is punctuated by the appearance of the Enryugo and its pilot Salamande, which as I inferred is too early for that to happen, especially as it once more highlights how the dragons could have gathered allies to free their trapped dragon Mother Aura from the Mitsurugi Empire, and yet that's not why Salamande is here. Oh no, it's solely as a plot device facilitating a change in venue. Salome singing the series' Song of Ruin, with Ange getting in on the melody, for both mecha to awaken their respective Discord feather attacks. Which for some reason the translation team for X now translates as Discord phaser, which did not make sense to me. For phaser as a word originates from Star Trek, and is intended as a type of stun weapon, its name being rooted in the phrase, to phase someone. This following from Gene Roddenberry's intent for the show to have its heroes more based on exploratory pursuits, and not existing as regimented military out to conquer or indoctrinate. Thus, their weapons would be ones that could not kill as their default setting, even the ship-mounted ones. The one that would need to deliberately be set to such as a conscious moral choice to kill would need to be made. You know, versus a gun that's just point and shoot. So, use of phaser in this context to the paramales and ragnamales of Cross Ange doesn't fit as the right translation, as the Discord Feather is not a stun weapon, but a weapon of mass destruction where the effect is visually calling upon a storm that can destroy the world, echoing in premise of the butterfly effect. Something small, simple, and beautiful, having massive chaotic discordant ramifications far beyond it, such as a butterfly flapping its wings somehow changing enough of an air current to cause a catastrophic storm, or an inherited aria sung to a machine unlocking a means of destroying the world. This seems like a minor thing, and it is, but that's the nature of a lot of my problems with the translation choices of these games after V as well. I didn't bring this up during the V reviews as I wasn't aware of it at the time, but a completely different translation team actually took over with X onwards with these games. And what they choose when they're not conforming to previous official media, with reflection ends up changing a lot of the intent and makes details like this less clear. Regardless, this is the actual reason Cross Ange's cast was introduced in this way, to act as a story device to get to the next group of character inductees, and one that should not have been included in this entry at all. And I say that because the series literally has no place being here, that show being Buddy Complex. And I doubt many people watching this know or even remember what that is. Buddy Complex was the first mecha anime between Gundam Build Fighters Tri, Cross Ange, and G-Reco that Sunrise released in 2014. And it also bombed, getting canned after just a single core. Barely any merchandise was made for it, and not a single mecha from the series ever saw any type of release, as there was no market for it. Cross Ange might be polarizing for its bad first episodes, but there was more than enough of a draw for it to get Robot Spirits figures for it made, with Good Smile having developed a motor right specifically of the Vilcus. And beyond that, the parallel designs were later readapted into the Gundam Eclipse to act as the central machine of the Gundam Seed side story of the same name. Buddy Complex? It doesn't have that. While Funimation licensed the show, it ended up doing badly in the West as well, as its storyline is another that just didn't work. Worse, it's a 13-episode series with 4 different writers, and none of them were particularly good. So it didn't feel like there was a unified vision for the story as a result, just by the room being too crowded. Those writers being Kurasumi Tsuneyama, Noboru Kimura, Tatsuka Orihata, and Yuichi Nomura. None of them are particularly known for good content between them. Though if you want notorious though, Kimura and Nomura are the standouts on that, with Kimura being most responsible for the 2017's Gundam Build Divers and Kyokai Senki, while Yoichi Nomura was the writer who is specifically credited with the depiction of Code Geass's Special Administrative Zone arc. I already explained at length the various problems of the SAZ, both from the logistics and writing perspective, as well as its sole story role as a trap for Lelouch, so I won't get into all of that again. But the SAZ seems to be a hallmark of Nomura's, where concepts they introduce do not seem to be thought through to their logical conclusions. And while every and any mecha anime deserves to at some point be featured in Super Robot Wars, it was wrong of the dev team to include it here, instead of holding onto it for a later game entry, which has been a problem with several Super Robot Wars games where the devs want to include a series but end up doing so when the time is not right for them. As I said earlier, X's story runs on an Isekai storyline, with the cast members all being collected from 3 differing worlds. One of peacetime, one of war, and one of revolution. And Buddy Complex does not fit into any of these timelines, which screws over that dynamic entirely. Instead, in order to include it, they made it be from a completely separate world entirely, as its events cannot be made to conform to fit any of the others. Because it is a time travel paradox story. And as I have said, for over a decade now, Japan is explicitly terrible when it comes to fiction that involves time travel as a major plot device, where the good ones are either exceptions to the rule, or the good elements of a story that involves it overwhelms how poorly executed the time travel element of their story may be. In Buddy Complex, 2014 teenager Alba is crushing on his classmate Hina, when a giant robot from the future comes to kill him. Hina, also from the future, fights it off, only for Alba to be sucked into the future himself, the year 2084, and end up getting conscripted into the military forces of the future, where he finds himself paired with the elite pilot, Dio. Wait, no, not that Dio. No, not that Dio. And no, not that Dio. For in the future, the military has created a quantum communication system that allows 2 pilots to coordinate their actions on a near-psychic level, allowing their tandem attacks and actions to overwhelm the enemy forces of other nations, one of whom happens to be Hina herself. Unfortunately, the writers of the show write Alba as a complete idiot, so the entirety of its length, simple to explain concepts go completely over his head. One of the central points being that the Hina he is fighting is not the Hina he knows, because the Hina that is his enemy has not yet experienced everything the Hina he knew did. This one is a younger version of her, while the one he knew is the older version that is farther along her relative experience in time by the point she travels back to the past to then become his classmate. Worse, the execution of that plot makes Hina's story one gigantic chicken and egg paradox, and that Hina was actually a young girl that was found on a battlefield, raised by an adoptive father in the military, then she joins it, has interactions with Alba, travels back to the past to be with Alba while protecting him from others who somehow time travel, and then dies, only to be reverted to a child to be found on that battlefield again, with no point of origin to her existence. But her existence must be there in order for Alba to be brought to the future to interact with her, that leads to her time traveling, so she must exist to protect him, but she will have died and become a child again, and her child form never originates from anywhere.
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
And people to this day still scoff at me when I say that Japanese writers in specific are bad at handling time travel as a plot device. Because you can literally fix this entire snarl with one simple change. Had the child Hina found on that battlefield not be an age-reverted Hina, but an attack on Alba in the 2014 time that starts this loop also have a mother with her child caught in it and transported to the future. The mother dies, leaving Hina to be orphaned, and now there is an origin point for both of them. In the first loop, the attacker has no reason to attack, as their travel wasn't deliberate. But since this itself changed time, so Alba would travel to the future, it instead becomes the first lap of a causality loop, where the events of time changing to accommodate for the cause and effect of time travel causes the entire consecutive series of events. So when Alba's actions in the future change the shape of the conflict, and his first lap establishment of a connection with Hina on the opposing side, the event that first caused the time travel still occurs, but the pilot that travels back now has a reason to attack Alba, thus leading to Hina's role, where she herself is sent back to protect Alba, and consequently in doing so preserve the time loop in perpetuity. And it's after those events conclude that you get your window to change the future by being aware of the events that are occurring. As if Alba were actually smart, he'd be keeping Hina's death in his head, and looking for a way to subvert that death, or make it so the known events are not the last action that takes place. To think of it in a different way, this is technically what happens at the end of my favorite movie of all time, Back to the Future. Marty McFly was the first time traveler to make changes to his past, and his alterations to the timeline require a version of himself to now be involved in those changes to maintain them. While he himself was not part of a causal loop, it is the subsequent iterations of him who lived with those changes to the timeline that must internally maintain them so they are not erased from existence. The Marty that is our protagonist is not part of those loops, as he's from the original timeline, but every other version of him is.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
But normally with causal loops, the cycle is what is important, and once part of them, it is very difficult to break the cycle, which is where the problem of the paradox comes in, as such loops cannot be maintained in the presence of a paradox. They have to be self-fulfilling. A paradox is an unsolvable contradiction, something that cannot be resolved as the origin cannot be explained without the end existing first. Thus, progression past the point of the paradox stops as, well, you hit the universe collapsing divide by zero error.
The encounter could create a time paradox, the results of which could cause a chain reaction that would unravel the very fabric of the space-time continuum and destroy the entire universe. Granted, that's a worst-case scenario.
So Buddy Complex's plot hinging itself on not just Hina's paradox, but also the Assailant's paradox. It turns out that attacking Time Traveler also ends up becoming the big bad of the series that started the entire conflict. But if he wasn't the big bad originally, then the technology that permits time travel in the setting would not have been created to begin with. Buddy Complex's story has no solution to these basic contradictions. Thus it tries to frame it all as the fault of science, instead of human malice. But doing so snarls up every other intention they may have had, and again, it had a simple solution to not invoke the paradox as it does, by these actions all being set in motion and self-sustaining, instead of making the need for them to occur be then why they occur. You can have the other time traveler help the conflict along, but you cannot make them the entire cause of everything else. And yet, they do. So you then question how things got to that point originally to incite the creation of the tech that would permit them to time travel to begin with. The conflict at the center of the story has to be depicted as building up independently of any mucking with time that is performed. And ironically, they could have had the scenario be focused on two destined lovers separated by divergent eras, only being allowed to meet due to a freak act of science, allowing them to be brought together, and the story is about the lead trying to save the other from what they mistakenly believe is an unchangeable fate. After all, 2 years after this, that became the very premise of Makoto Shinkai's award-winning film, Your Name. Which, while I don't care for the film personally, is on that list of Japanese media that actually knew how to properly use the concept of time travel to tell its story. Whereas in Buddy Complex, it becomes all about breaking time, both to start its story and then to end it.
My brain is melting. How can events happen before the ones that happened before?
Just the way it works. It's jeramie, bearimy. I don't know what to tell you. That's the easiest way to describe it.
The time travel plotline of this series entirely unnecessarily overcomplicates a war story that frankly isn't really interesting to begin with, as the reasons for the international conflict are really poorly addressed. Even with Alba being an outsider to the conflict, allowing an easy means of exposition. Two sides are in conflict, Alba has this connection to a character on the other side, and for them, that's enough, even though it's entirely one-sided. It's like these collective writers saw what a few Gundam series, and Code Geass, did with friends or loved ones being on opposite sides of a conflict and what it could do for narrative drama, and wanted to recreate it. Only they decided to make such entirely one-sided, and then followed a horrible trend of Japanese authors at the time of making their main character an unreconstructed moron who has little audience appeal because they are an unreconstructed moron. Actually makes this worse, however, as both causal loops and paradoxes are closed systems, isolated from being interfered with. They cannot be externally influenced, as after they are, the cycle that is needed to maintain them is entirely broken. Once it is broken, the changes that need to be perpetuated no longer exist. They are no longer fluid. They are set in stone. So taking these characters out of their setting to Alworth at any point just collapses the entire intention of the tale by making it so either the characters brought into buddy conflicts' story are just as much trapped in the loop as everyone else, or it makes it so those changes are no longer self-perpetuating, but permanent alterations that now have no origin. You might think that would be a good thing since buddy complex isn't good, but X forgets about that entirely, so what shouldn't be continued anymore actually does, just without any of the invoked causes. It's on autopilot, which of course exposes the masquerade that the change in setting is doing nothing to change the overall course of their story, but justify it happening unheeded, despite them blaming it all on a character that had nothing to do with it in a failed attempt to explain it, which is entirely the wrong way to approach addressing the narrative paradox. That is what makes a bad Super Robot Wars game, because SRW is unique in that you don't have to follow the script. You can fix it here. You just need the writer to be aware of where to diverge. And that didn't happen.
Occasionally, that moment on the bearimy timeline is the time moment when nothing never occurs. So, you get it.
Hell, it's just as present when we actually swing back to the cast we'd already collected, who are baffled by this transposition, with them asking Ange to take them back, and Ange telling them it doesn't work that way, as if she'd done this before. Yeah, she hasn't. As I said earlier, X introduces Ange before the point that she starts unlocking the Vilkis' special Ragnamail abilities, and even in canon, she only figured out how to do that from observing Salamandre do it herself, and had to be walked through how to use the Discord Feather later to use it as a means to traverse worlds. You can't even justify this with how V handled it, as their Ange has a training arc to get her used to and fully capable of using the Ragnamail skills. Here, this is either another translation error, or the original writer completely forgot Ange shouldn't have that yet. And I lean the former over the latter because the Vilkis doesn't have access to Discord Feather as a skill until much later in the game. So as I said, the story using it here wasn't with purpose of properly introducing or using the cross-Ange content, but it's a story device by which to then start including another series that shouldn't even be here. Regardless, they get caught up as well in the beginning episodes of Buddy Complex. Its conflict centered between the Free Pact Alliance and the Great Zogilian Republic. And their conflict is all based out of a trade war over a fictional natural resource called nectarbilium, which apparently is itself an energy-releasing radioactive matter. That can't be good! I mean, once again, back to Code Geass, Sakurai in that setting wasn't a power source, it was a superconductor that could store vast amounts of power, which made more sense to have a war over than a collection of radioactive rocks. When, solar power is a thing. As if nectarabilium releases energy, then you're still running everything on electric anyways. Hell, that name is very hard to say when the material is just basically Energon from Transformers. Regardless, Zogilia was the first to discover the resource and has since held a near monopoly over it, and had become aggressive after other countries with the same resource that are part of the Free Pact Alliance attacked them first. So basically we're stuck siding with the guys who started the war and are completely oblivious to their wrongdoing throughout the story. We just sided with this world's version of Britannia or Gundam Seed's Earth Alliance. And yet the setting is not self-aware enough to understand or acknowledge that they were in the wrong, but instead blame another person that logically should not be the origin point of such malice. Yeah, this is totally a Sunrise production, they keep screwing that up. This stage gives us our second capital ship, the Cygnus. And as much as I diss on the series, the Cygnus actually is a pretty decent battleship. Certainly it's a better designed one than the Megafauna is, at least. As well as Buddy Complex's deuteragonist Dio Weinberg in his Braedion unit. Alba being dropped in here thanks to the time travel mess, and just straight up being dropped in the Braedion sibling unit, the Luxon. But this is needed due to the combat system I mentioned before. The coupling system that allows the two paired pilots to communicate telepathically on a quantum level. With regards to the time travel plot, this is actually why Alba was dragged here. Because he will develop a coupling connection with Dio. And because the coupling technology is based on quantum communication, it means that their bond is rooted in the concept of quantum entanglement. For those who aren't aware of what that is, well, if you've seen the Ant-Man movies, you've kind of gotten a primer on it already. Quantum refers to the tiniest forms of particles we are currently aware of, on the scale of photons and electrons, that work to explain the nature of how matter and energy work. And from observation, it's been determined that certain quantum particles can become linked with each other regardless of the distance between them, which can act in contradiction to the systems they are separately part of, but are explicable from the viewpoint that the point of entanglement is not operating in four-dimensional space, as spatial dimensions don't operate the same way on matter that is that tiny. Some have theorized that quantum entanglement can be used for communication, as if you find a way to transmit data to one entangled particle, then the other would also receive the information, and means of data transfer will be able to translate that information both forward and back, thus providing a means of faster-than-light communication, which if used in computing would also allow for processing limits to exceed any physical constraints, and would be unable to be hacked by anything that is not already part of that entangled system. The problem is, it doesn't work, as there is a bandwidth issue to that data transfer. With fiber optic cable, electrons are being transmitted down a wire in a pattern that can be understood by the receiving device as interpretable data. With wireless technology, that information is instead being converted into radio waves that operate off of wavelengths of electrons. Now imagine all of that information that is coded to be transferred by an uncountable series of electrons, and trying to make it all fit into one electron that is only communicating to one other electron at a noble distance away. Scientists cannot shrink the bandwidth enough to get anything properly out of it. At least not yet. But the possibility of quantum communication working in the future has been a fixture of sci-fi series for several years now. One of the popular ideas of such is quantum entanglement working beyond the limits of not just distance by space, but distance by time. Ergo, the logic the series runs with in slingshotting Alba to here, to then immediately be able to use the coupling system, because at some point the pair will end up entangled like that, even if neither has yet experienced such. And also ignoring the fact that our bodies replace every single cell and atom that is part of our flesh every 10 years, and Alba is from 70 years before Buddy Complex's main story is set. Quantum. Frankly, that short span of time is itself problematic to the major bullet points of the tale, but it's the least of the problems at this point.
とにかく何とかしてみせないと。コネクティブってよ。アクセプション。誰だか知らないが、こちらに合わせろ。そんなこと言われても。おとなしく従え。うわー
Yeah, that's about it. As in execution, it's no different than a pair of combatants with history and trust between them being able to act in sync with each other. Which, the usual appeal of such in a series that makes such a hype moment is the build-up to the point where a group can get to that level of seamless interaction and effectiveness. The coupling system, as a result, is a shortcut to such action scenes, removing the build-up that makes such so appreciated by those who were there for the journey to the combo attacks. This is especially unfortunate for SRW, as combo attacks are frequently the reward for pairing up matching groups of units on the map, and Buddy Complex's star units only have relevance by deliberately manipulating the mechanic. And ironically, it's easier to use such if you keep one of the two off the field in reserve, as that next allows you to use the relevant in-series combo attacks with just a damage reduction to it. Regardless, our troop comes in and helps fend off the forces, the enemy leader Bison calling off the mission as a failure, though they at least got some data on the coupling units for later use. Which is where we're going to call it for now, as we went long again, and we've really not even begun the game. Fortunately, we are through most of the new series introduced this time in SRW. As for what's left, well, let me put it this way. Believe in the me that believes in you!